What's up, guys? I've got a video today on a 1997 GMC 1500 Suburban, but this will be the same on any similar GMC or Chevy. This in particular is a four-wheel drive truck. So what we're doing today is I bought a kit for basically the entire front end, and what that included was upper and lower ball joints, sway bar links, inner and outer tie rod ends, as well as the connecting sleeves for the tie rod ends, and then it also included the pitman arm and the idler arm, I want to say is what it's called. So anyway, what I want to show you is just kind of a couple things. I've got one side done, the driver's side done, and now I'm here on the passenger side, and just want to kind of run through some things to be ready for and a few tips and tricks that I used just to help you get this job done. So basically all I've done so far is taken the wheel off, and then the first thing I did is disconnected my tie rod. So what you'll do, you can see it's missing here, but what you'll do is take off your nut here. I think that's a 13/16, and then you also have a 13/16 in there on your inner tie rod end. What I used on the inner is this separator fork, and just pounded that in there to knock the inside out. And then on the outer tie rod end, if you just whack your knuckle a few times here, it will just fall out. So remove that, and then I laid it on the floor next to the new parts and tried to get it roughly the same length. This will obviously have to go for an alignment, but just to get it somewhat in the neighborhood so I don't scrub the tires off or get in a wreck on the way to the alignment rack. Okay, next, this is the way that I've done this. I don't know if it's the best or the only way, but I just want to share it with you. What I did is removed the entire knuckle, caliper, rotor, and got it out of the way to start the job. So what you're going to do is remove this little dust cover from up here, and you're going to rip a lot of those out. I'm just going to drill new holes to reattach it. Then disconnect your ABS wiring, and then unbolt it with this 13mm bolt, and then this will just pull out. It's a plastic similar to these clips. Just pull that straight out. You've got your two little clips here that just grab the upper control arm, and then you've got one single bolt, also a 13mm, that goes through your upper ball joint that holds the upper part of that harness on. Once you've got that off, you can remove your upper and lower ball joint bolt or nuts. I was going to say bolts. So you've got your one nut under here, and I'm losing track of the sizes. I think it's a 15/16 or a 7/8, right in that neighborhood. Same thing on your lower nut down here. Remove that. What you may want to do is only remove one or the other first while you separate it. That way it doesn't just fall apart, and you have some structure in place while you're pounding on one or the other. So I think what I'll do is just start with my upper and undo that nut and release the upper, then move to the lower. The last thing you're going to need to do is remove your axle nut and tap your CV axle through the rotor to get it out of the way, and that will finally allow you to remove the entire knuckle assembly. One thing I guess I forgot is your brake hose is what is that, a 7/16 or 12mm on your banjo bolt for your brake hose. I've got that pinched off up here and out of the way. I'm sure I'll get some negative comments on my needle nose vice grips. That's fine. So once you've got all that done, I guess the only thing is be careful that when you're undoing your upper and lower nuts, you've already undone your axle nut and given that a slight tap. You don't want to risk pulling your axle, your CV joint apart, your CV axle apart. So undo that a little bit so it's loose in there. That way when you undo the upper and lower ball joints, it'll just pull out. And you can get that out of the way. It's pretty heavy, so be careful with that. The next thing, as far as the upper ball joint goes, what I ended up doing, I've done it before where I replaced just the ball joint, and that's what came in the kit. The problem with that is these factory ball joints are riveted in place, and you can do it. It's quite a bit of extra time in a lot of cases. You're just going to grind those rivets off and pound them through or drill them out and remove your ball joint. That's definitely an option. In my particular case, where I'm trying to save the customer money, as always, the labor of me doing that, it's going to take an extra maybe 45 minutes to an hour. The labor of me doing that versus just replacing the entire upper control arm with the ball joint already installed is not worth it. So in this case, I'm just going to replace the entire upper control arm. But it is definitely an option, and if you have bought yourself a kit and you're doing this yourself, if I were doing it myself, I would probably do just the ball joint, because my own time, I'm not charging myself my labor rate. So in that case, I'll try and improve the lighting here. You're just going to grind off, there's actually three rivets, and then one was the bolt that held our harness in place. Either grind those flat and tap them through with a punch, or you can drill them out. In either case, it's not going to be fun. So that's what that looks like. If you're going to remove the control arm, you've just got your bolts on either side up here, one there and one back there, and those came out very easily for me, so I would much prefer that method. On the lower ball joint, see how our lighting is, that one I had a huge pain with. It's only pressed in. There's not like a locking ring or anything in my case. You do have your cotter pin through the castle nut, which is going to poke right through there, and you'll pull that out, remove the nut, and then pound on our knuckle, get the knuckle out of the way, and then using a ball joint press, you'll push the ball joint out, and I'll grab the new one to show you what it looks like here. Here it is. Okay, so here's what our ball joint looks like. And again, it's just pressed in from the bottom up, and you can see there's just the knurling there. It's just a friction fit, no lock device of any sort. One thing you want to do is index your grease fitting. There's a slight slot in the lower control arm. It's kind of at the 2 o'clock position. You want to make sure that's lined up so that you can access that once it's in place. Also, make sure that you remove your grease boot before you press this in. You don't want to be pressing against your grease boot or you'll damage it. So this just pulls off with a flat screwdriver or whatever. I just can't do it one-handed. But you'll pull that off, and using your ball joint press this back in. The problem I had was every time I pressed on it, it would go crooked, and I couldn't press. I tried many different orientations with the press, and it took me about an hour and a half to finally get it in with what should have been like a 20-minute thing. So what I finally ended up doing is got it as close as I could. So I had it probably 3/8 of an inch in place, but it was slightly crooked. Then I removed the press and actually put my floor jack underneath it between my lift and the ball joint. But if you're on the ground, I've done it that way too. And I actually made a highly controversial video on that on my Lincoln Town Car ball joint replacement. But what I did there is used the jack with one of the press rings from the kit, so I'm not pressing against the threads, and just put some pressure on the ball joint. So just lift it up till the car just starts to lift up. That way you know you've got good pressure on it. And then I pound downward on the lower control arm, so I'm pounding against the jack wherever it needs it. So in my case, it was up in there like this, so I pounded over here on the control arm, which put more pressure there and actually straightened it out, and then I just kind of worked my way around slowly and finally got it pressed in place. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's how I finally got that done. The last thing, actually the last two things that I'm doing as a part of this job, one is what came with the kit, and that's the sway bar links here. Basically every sway bar link I've ever come into contact with, I've had to cut out of place, which is not a huge deal in this case. It's just a bolt style versus like a ball joint style sway bar link. So all you do there is cut it right in the middle. The top half will just pull out. The bottom half has this little plug. There's a little plastic plug in here. You can get like a chisel or a screwdriver under that and pry that out. It just pulls out. And then that gives you access up in there to the bottom side of your sway bar link, which at that point, since you cut it, you should be able to tap it through the hole, through the lower control arm, and it'll come out. Now, when you're reinstalling, you can see the way this is done from the factory. They have the bolt head at the top. It's focusing on my finger there. They have the bolt head at the top instead of the nut at the top. So they've put this in from the top down. What I did, so I'm not trying to line up a nut and bushing and washer up inside of the control arm, is I put it from the bottom up. And the only thing I had to change by doing it that way is to allow the same amount of clearance where there's like a 3/8 of an inch bolt head up here. I had my nut and probably 1.5 inches of extra thread, and I just cut that off. So I'll take you around to the other side and show you what that looks like. So you can see here, I've got my sway bar link coming from the bottom up, and right there is my nut, and then I just cut the threads off to allow a nice amount of clearance here between the upper control arm and the sway bar link. So it looks kind of squashed right now, but the car's up on the lift, so it's kind of a goofy angle that it's working with, but that'll straighten out. And I guess I'll just kind of show you around with the finished side. The last thing I was going to mention is that I put a new shock in here. This car needed it anyway, but it's a nice time to do all this stuff while you're in here, because everything else is out of the way, and it's going to go for an alignment anyway, which is why I opted to do the kit. And he had been quoted, the customer had been quoted that all of these things needed to be done anyway. So just a nice amount of access while you're here to do all this. That reminds me with one thing relating to reinstallation, and then, sorry this is getting kind of confusing at this point, but when you're trying to put your knuckle back in place after you've got your lower ball joint finished, you have to get your axle slightly through the rotor, through the hub, before you can hook it on that lower ball joint. If you do hook the lower ball joint first, you'll realize that you can't flex it away from the axle enough to get it back through there. At least not in my case, using my my specific orientation with my lift. I guess if you were using a case where you're lifting on the frame and you can flex your lower control arm down out of the way, that would work, but it'll make sense once you're to that point. So I think that's it for today, and sorry I make my videos this way in some cases, but if you were making a video, it would make sense to you. So hopefully that answers a few questions, and if you do have any other questions, I try to respond as soon as I see a comment. So if you're in the middle of a job and needing some guidance, I try to do that in any case, as long as I see the comment right away. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you guys on the next video.